Hello fellow kin, welcome back to the channel and welcome to another competitive list review. I was planning on covering the Texas Major event this week, but I came across a list online at another event that made me raise an eyebrow and was really something I've never seen before. So I thought it'd be interesting to cover it for this week's video, and then maybe we'll do the Texas Major next week instead. So on today's agenda, we'll be jumping into the Austrian Open event. I will not even attempt to pronounce the name, held on February 24th to 25th, 2024. As always, we'll take a look at the Votann placings, look at the matchups, the overall score. We'll do a deep dive into the list analysis, examine some strengths and weaknesses, and then we'll contextualize the results of the placing. The list in today's episode was piloted by Peter Steiner, who came first place out of 26 players, ending the event with a score of 6 wins, 0 draws, and 0 losses. The matchups had a WTC scoring system, so that's why the numbers on the screen are a little bit lower than what you'll typically see. So what we see for Game 1 is Votann at 16 points against Custodes at 4. Game 2 is a Votann victory of 20 points against Blood Angels at 0. Game 3 is Votann into Necrons with a victory of 17 to 3. Game 4, Votann at 11 versus Death Guard at 9, much closer. Votann at 12 to Eldari at 8 for Game 5, and then wrapping the event up we have Game 6 with a Votann victory of 15 to Necrons at 5. So I said this is going to be a weird list, and I think it is if you look at it on the screen here. We'll start things off jumping in with the characters. So we have 2 Iron champions, nothing too crazy here. One of them is going to be running Appraising Glare, and the other one will not be having an enhancement. The third character is a Cal, and the Cal will be running Grim Demeanor as their enhancement, allowing him and the unit to essentially ignore any modifiers to their profile. And already this is where things get interesting. So we have 3 characters, but we only have 1 unit of Hearthguard being a 10-man squad. And so these guys have the Hesir with the Hammer, Teleport Crest, and they're also running the 9 Hearthguard in the unit, each equipped with Plasma Guns and Gauntlets. Now, as you can imagine, these guys are going to be accompanied by the Cowl and Deep Strike, because the Cowl is going to provide them with the lethal hits and the Grim Demeanor, meaning you get a little bit more efficiency out of the unit. But what about the other 2 characters? It's weird, because I haven't seen this done since the early Index days of 10th edition, where people were running single, lone Ioneer champions with the Wayfarer's Grace enhancement, running around the board, just being a little bit annoying. But in this list, we don't even have Wayfarer's Grace. We just literally have 2 Ioneer champions, one of which is running Appraising Glare all alone, all by himself, and the other one just bare bones with nothing on him, both of them equipped with the Mass Hammers, and I'm struggling to visualize where these guys are going and how they're being used on the table. They definitely don't go in Deep Strike because they're not running the Teleport Crest, and I'm reluctant to say they come out of Strategic Reserves because they don't natively get reroll charges by themselves. They actually only get reroll charges if they're attached to a unit, meaning you're not actually going to benefit from that rule. So it looks like you start these guys on the table and you basically use them to either hold objectives or just, again, go around and be a little bit annoying. I suppose if you think about it, the Ioneer champion is probably one of the cheapest ways we can actually hold an objective with our current roster of units available to us, because he's only 60 points bare bones. Typically, if we were to use a character, we'd probably opt for the Grimnir with Wayfarer's Grace. It just allows you to have something a little bit cheaper than the Warriors, but somewhat durable and with a lot of wounds to just spread out and hold an objective, with a slightly bigger footprint. But with the Ioneer champion, I wonder, because I understand the reasoning behind the point selection. It's only 60 points, you save 5. With this exact list, it actually runs you at 2,000 points on the dot, so there technically wouldn't be any room for a Grimnir in the list. But I still think it's a really fascinating choice to include 2 Ioneer champions not following a unit, so not attached to anyone, and simply putting them on the board to start, because these guys are definitely not going into Deep Strike. I also don't necessarily think they're going to be used in the Sagittars either, because, as we'll look at in a second, we do have 5, and we have adequate recipients for these among our other units in the list. So I'm really not sure how these guys are being utilized, but clearly they work quite well, because we have some pretty good matchups as we'll look at towards the end of the video, and it's a solid victory across the board. I'm really curious to hear the pilot's thoughts on this, or yours as well if you have any idea how the champions are being used. Moving along, we have 2 squads of 10 Hearthkin Warriors. This is very standard. I've always been a fan of running 20. I recently got to play a few games with my current list, running 20 of them, and I did feel like I didn't necessarily need the full squads. I could have probably got by with just one squad of 10, but I think if you're running a lot of Sagittars, then you absolutely need to bring multiple squads of Hearthstone Warriors, simply because that's the primary recipient to filling the transport tax. So I totally understand why this is taken. And in terms of loadouts, this is the loadout I usually run on all of mine, with the plasma pistol on your Thane. And then in terms of special weapons, you have the magma rail and the Hylas. It doesn't really matter all that much. However, like I always say, I strongly recommend the Hylas because it allows you to get access to an assault weapon in the squad, meaning that that unit, when it's separated in two, is able to advance and still be eligible to shoot, which means it could do actions after advancing, giving you a little bit extra range since you're only movement 5. So again, 2 squads of these, same loadouts. Next up, we have 2 squads of 5 Chthonian Berserks. These guys are running the Mauls, and they have the included Mole Grenade Launcher, which is free, so why would you never take it? I go into a lot of detail in my prior unit analysis video that came out earlier this week on the Chthonian Berserks and their preferred loadout. I do think that both options have play, but the Mauls are generally going to be what you go for, simply because they have a really good chance of punching up, so significantly above their points value and into things that are much tougher than they are. The selection for Mauls actually makes a lot of sense within the context of this list, which we'll look at in a second once we finish talking about one of the next few units coming up, which is also a really interesting choice. But we'll come back to this in a second. So then we also have the 10-man Iron Hearthguard, which we mentioned at the beginning of the analysis discussion. So these guys are running the Teleport Crest, the Hammer, Plasmas, and the Gauntlets, and they're going to be attached to the Cal. It's a really strong hammer unit. It comes down, it deletes basically everything, especially if it doesn't have an invulnerable save, and it's just a really tough and annoying body to deal with because you got so many wounds, and they're all -1 to be wounded, and they're T6, and they have really good saves. So solid staple unit, nothing too surprising here. Personally, I'm more of a fan of running the Vulcanites over the Plasmas. I just feel like too many things have good invulnerable saves these days, and it's pretty tough for me to actually get the Plasmas to connect, on paper anyway. I haven't actually tried Plasmas. I always run the Vulcanites instead because I just think it's going to play better into my meta and into the armies I play against. But I understand why he opted for Plasmas in this case, because there's so much access to small arms fire everywhere else, which again we'll look at in a second. I want to skip slightly ahead to the Sagittars. Now for the Sagittars, we see 5 are taken in this list, each one running the Hylas. And so the Hylas, as we've seen countless times already, is very effective when we have multiple bodies carrying this weapon, because we actually are able to account for some of the variability by reducing the overall variance. We have more chances to average out and get a higher damage shot that goes through, or the sustained hit shot that goes through. And generally, this is why you would take the Hylas over the missile launcher if you're running multiple Sagittars, because you aren't that concerned about missing a shot with one, because you have 4 others that are following up next. I was always on the fence about Hylas versus missile launcher. In my list, I run only 2 Sagittars, and I decided to ultimately go with the Hylas, simply because for those moments where you roll hot and you do get a 6 and then you suddenly spike and you're able to get D3 extra shots that go through and then you roll your damage, I just think the ceiling is so much higher that it's actually just, in my opinion, not even worth compromising for the lower damage output but more reliable missile launcher instead. I'm just a big fan of that potential to spike. I think even if you're running 2, it's probably still worth it. But some lists might not even necessarily need the Hylas because they have that anti-tank built into other platforms, as we saw with a list that was running 2 Hecatons with the Magna Rail launchers. But in this case here, our main source of anti-tank damage will come from the Sagittars, and so we've essentially doubled up on that. We have 5 in this list, and they're all running the Hylas. Alright, now for the elephant in the room, the second reason why I thought this list was a little bit interesting and why I wanted to talk about it in today's episode, and that is 3 squads of Pioneers, 2 squads of 6-man, and 1 squad of 3. So in total here, 15 Pioneers are being taken in this list, which is a lot. And I know some of you are going to be really happy to see this because I keep seeing comments asking for lists that have a lot of Pioneers in them and if they have play. Well, it looks like they do. So in terms of loadouts on these Pioneers, across the board we have the very standard high-las rotary cannon. So in the squad of 3 we're taking 1, and then in both squads of 6 we're actually taking 2 high-las rotary cannons. In terms of war gear options, for the 3-man we have the scanner and the searchlight, and then for the 6-man units we've taken 1 of everything. This is a very unique list, and I think a very unique inclusion to have the characters like this and the 15 bikes. Now, why do I think this works? I mentioned throughout this discussion that I think there are some considerations that are made between each unit that was included and why it fits together in the way that allows this list to perform quite well. And the primary reason for that is because we have, at its core, we have a standard mechanized body of Sagittars, and then because of that we have to fill them logically, so we take some Hearthkin Warriors to split up and put inside. Now we run the Berserks all with Mauls because we actually don't care about having something that could kill chaff, like the Axes or for the sweep profile, for example. We don't actually need that because we're running so many Pioneers. The amount of anti-infantry shooting power that these Pioneers can put out is astronomical, especially if you were to pop a stratagem for sustained hits too on one of the 6-man squads. That is a ton of shots that are coming out. So because of that, we've invested a lot of points into anti-infantry killing just based on the mobility of the Pioneers as well. Now, we also have the 10-man Hearthguard, which, as many of you know, through experience, I'm sure, their shooting output is exceptional into anti-infantry as well with their grenade launchers. But we've opted for the plasmas here, and the reason being is that we need to have some reliable anti-tank shooting that comes in because we've leaned a little bit heavier into anti-infantry with the Pioneers. This means we have the Pioneers acting as our base for anti-infantry killing. We have our Berserks acting as the anti-elite and anti-higher toughness melee threat and trading piece. We have the Sagittars that are equipped to have somewhat variable shooting output, but always directed at being anti-tank. And then we have the Hearthguard, which are basically the best of both worlds. The inclusion of the Pioneers is also interesting because we've essentially sacrificed a spot for something that might have been a little bit better at playing primary, like a Hecaton Land Fortress, or maybe some smaller squads of Ioneer Hearthguard as well. We don't necessarily have a ton of durability unless we play our Sagittars on primary. So instead of having the Sagittars maybe flank or go by the side, we're really bringing these guys down the middle. And I think this works because of the 10-man Hearthguard brick and because of the Pioneers, which essentially flank both sides, or very likely are probably flanking both sides, to pick up any units that try to cut through, while your Concussion Maul Berserks are staging inside of their own Sagittars, ready for the countercharge. I thought about this a little bit while I was editing the video, and I actually think instead of having the 2 Ioneer champions run down the middle as a second wave that is sort of acting as a double punch, I think you actually bring them down the sides. So you're going to be going for side objectives with these guys. Hopefully your opponent has something that's pretty light and manageable there, because I think that's where they'd probably be best utilized. I'm not 100% sure on this again, because I've never seen these used like this, but if I had to guess, I could see them going down for the side objectives, probably the weaker of the 2, and just trying to steal that as you have 2 pretty heavy hitters that have decent saves. All the while, you have your Hearthguard brick supporting and acting as the main hammer, and then you have your Sagittars, which are probably going to be touching as many objectives as they can, and the Pioneers skirmish around the board, picking up basically anything that's not in a really high toughness bracket. I think it's a really funny list. I've never seen something like this before, so it kind of took me off guard because I didn't really know how the Ioneer champions are playing. And again, this is just my assumption as how this works, looking at all the pieces in this puzzle and trying to put it all together. In terms of strengths, I think without a doubt it's an exceptionally fast list. It's really quick with the bikes and the Sagittars, and it gets where it needs to go very fast and very effectively and reliably. Because of that, I think it has excellent scoring potential. You have Sagittars that are stocked up with your battle line, you have the 3-man unit of bikes that could go into reserves and then pop back out, and you have your 6-mans, which are very quick too. If you could play them defensively, maybe early on, and have them scored later on in the game, they could come out and just be an absolute menace to whatever's left on the table. I think the list is pretty good on primary as well, simply because you have your Sagittars, which act as really tough bodies. You also have some of those built-in layers of forward pressure because of the Hearthguard, Berserks, and the 2 characters, which are good supporting pieces. One of the biggest strengths I could think of is that it's such a unique build that there's a very real layer of unfamiliarity against something like this. If you're an opponent and you're playing against Votann, you're probably expecting some Sagittars, you're expecting the Hearthguard, of course, but what do you do when you have 15 bikes on the table in your face? How do you deal with that? Because typically people use their bikes very defensively to just go up and down and score when they can. But in this list, I think they're playing a much more aggressive style of play, and that's something that might take people by surprise. As I mentioned in the analysis of the list, I think when you look at the pieces independently, it looks a little bit weird, but when you put everything together, we actually get a pretty nice balanced output. We have a really good mix of anti-infantry, anti-elite, good primary, good secondary, durability, offensiveness, and I think it all meshes together pretty well. Now, no list is without its flaws, and for weaknesses, I do think it has poorer staying power than some of the other lists we see that run Hecaton Land Fortresses or multiple bricks of Hearthguard. And the main reason for this is because your bikes take up a pretty decent amount of points, and for all their speed and their wounds, they're really not that durable. If somebody wanted to pick up the squad of bikes, I think they could very easily do so. I've had these things absolutely melt the small arms fire. They have a base 4-up save. And yes, sure, you could get into cover, you could pop void armor on them, but I still think that they're just not quite as durable as I would like them to be because of that native 4+ save. However, they are 2 OC at least, which does help compensate for that. So if you do get a squad of these on an objective, this could maybe contribute to having a little bit of a stronger primary play. Now, in terms of hammers and anvils, I put a question mark here because it is a little bit all over the place. You have a lot of dual purpose units, I think, in this list because you have your Hearthguard 10-man brig, which typically could be a very good hammer. I think in this list it might actually be playing more of an anvil, while your Sagittars are maybe playing a little more offensively. It's a tough call because it's something that's I'm not even familiar with, to be honest with you, but just trying to piece it together from what I see, I do think there's a little bit of a mixed role going on, and this isn't necessarily a weakness, but as you're probably familiar with in my formats by now, I put a question mark here because it's something I'd like to know the pilot's perspective on. The last thing I put as a weakness is character utilization, and again, this has a question mark. It's not overtly clear to me how the Iron champions are being used in this list, and because of that, I can only assume the most logical thing is that they're going to be used to throw down onto a primary somewhere on the table and just act as a recurring wave of damage that's coming through, because they do have pretty decent output with their weapon. But that said, are there better uses for characters to maybe try to play secondaries or primaries? Would a Grimnir be a better choice? Sure, with points you might lose out on one of the other Ioneer champions, but could a Grimnir maybe be a better choice here and maybe throw an enhancement on him for that added durability and redundancy? Again, not something I'm sure is a weakness, just more of a curiosity. In terms of matchups, let's start things off with the first game, which was into Custodes. Now, the Custodes player was running 2 Blade champions, a Shield Captain, Trajan Valoris, a few squads of Custodian guards, you got some prosecutors, some wardens, some witch seekers, and they allied in a Kalidas assassin with the Lord Inquisitor Draxus. Now, I actually think Votann do quite well into Custodes, namely because they're such an elite army. So typically when we're playing against something elite, it's much easier for us to get value out of our judgment tokens because we have 4, and if it's an elite opponent, they have fewer units on the table. So we just pick the 4 scariest things. I think in this case it'd be the 2 Warden squads and the 2 biggest Custodian squads for guards, and those units are essentially no longer a danger to us. Because if we see them, we shoot them, we'll probably kill them, and if they come into melee with us, at least we're able to punch a little bit harder, despite Custodes usually coming out on top with that. Now, I think the Pioneers were actually very effective in this list. Why is that? Because not only are most of their guns strength 5 or above, meaning they're going to be wounding Custodes with the strength 5 guns on 3s, and then with everything else on 2s, but they have a lot of shots that come out, especially if you pop sustained hits too. And Custodes are very vulnerable to small arms fire in mass amounts. So what actually happens here is that it doesn't matter that they're so durable because these units are pumping out so many effective shots wounding on 2s that a lot of saves are going to have to be taken and most of them will fail. It's also especially helpful since we ignore cover with the bikes, meaning that their 2-up base save is actually never going to stay at 2-up. Additionally, if I was playing into Custodes, I wouldn't be worried about the sisters because I actually think generally we just instantly wipe them when we do see them. So despite Custodes having a very strong primary game here, I actually think this Votann list is very good at countering them, because we are able to effectively punch back from a safe distance without having to get into combat with the Custodians. And if we do, let's say we're a big Hearthguard brick, at least we have the Berserks available with their 3 damage weapon profiles to effectively trade back. Even if they pop fights first on one side, at least we have our other unit jumping in to fight and pick up the other squad instead, which I do think will happen. And if they do end up killing the Berserks first, the Berserks have a chance to fight back on death, which is really helpful. Plus the Mole Grenade Launchers slow things down, which is always good. All in all, I think Votann have a very good game into this Custodes list in this matchup, allowing them the mobility to dominate on primary and secondary and take a significant lead. Game 2 into Blood Angels, the opponent was running Lamardes with a Chaplain and Jump Pack, a Lieutenant with Combi Weapon, Assault Intercessors with Jump Packs, 2 big squads of Death Company Marines with Jump Packs, Inceptor Squad, Infiltrators, some Scouts, and they had 2 Death Company Dreadnoughts and 2 Gladiator Reapers. Now, as you can imagine, for very similar reasons as to why Votann did very well into Custodes in the previous matchup, I think this is amplified in the Blood Angels game instead, where still relatively semi-elite, but significantly less tough than the Custodes. Where our Hearthguard squad probably didn't do all that much to a 4-up invulnerable save with the Custodes, here against Blood Angels, these guys will absolutely melt anything that they shoot at. Furthermore, because of the elite nature of the list, you simply have to pick out the scariest things with your Judgment tokens, being the Death Company Marines and probably the Gladiator Reapers, and then you'll have a very easy game once you pick these things up by simply drawing line of sight with your bikes. There simply isn't enough long-range anti-tank in the Blood Angels list to effectively deal with your Sagittars, meaning that you will always out-trade your opponent's platforms. You just simply shoot your Sagittars into their Gladiator Reapers, pick them up, and then now your Sagittars can basically go around freely without having to worry. If your opponent commits his Death Company into your Sagittars, then that is very good for us, because now they're open, they're vulnerable, and we could hit them with the bikes or with the Hearthguard instead. Sure, you have to worry about the Death Company Dreadnoughts coming in from reserves with their additional bonus to charges because of their Magna Grapple, but if you play cagey enough, I don't think they'll be a big danger. And even if they do get in, they pick up a Sagittar, maybe, and then we immediately trade them back with the Berserks inside. Overall, I actually think the big bricks of Death Company are detrimental in this matchup, giving Votann a significant advantage of target priority. And as we see with the end result, it was a victory of 20 points to 0 for Votann against the Blood Angels. Game 3 into Necrons, the opponent is running 3 Technomancers, 2 Catan Shards, 1 Nightbringer, 1 Void Dragon, Emotech the Stormlord, we have some Scarab Swarms for secondary play, Locust Destroyers, and we have 3 big 6-man bricks of Wraiths, in addition to 3 Canoptek Doomstalkers, which are a staple. Now, this is a very durable list. It's pretty staple for what we see with Canoptek Court. I think the main advantage Votann has in this game is their mobility, which is obviously as a result of the bikes and all the Sagittars they're running. Necrons, for how durable they are, especially with their Catans, are actually pretty slow. I would argue a little less mobile than we are even. So I think having that advantage here is really good because it allows us to get to different places on the board, potentially kite out the Catans long enough for us to score enough points and get a nice lead. And we do have means of dealing with the Canoptek Wraiths because we could put Judgment tokens on them. I would assume in this case the player put 3 tokens on the Canoptek Wraith squads and then put his final one on one of the 2 Catan Shards. This gives you a really nice amount of play because the things that are going to be in your face, being the Wraiths, are going to be more vulnerable to your shooting and your melee because you've essentially allocated tokens to them, meaning that when these things come to you and try to pin you down, you actually can effectively deal with them. Think about dropping your Hearthguard squad down, 10-man brick, into a unit of Canoptek Wraiths. You'll probably pick up a few Wraiths. If you get the charge in, great. You have your trading pieces sitting inside of the Sagittars, being the Berserks. These guys are damage 3 weapons, very effective, very strong at strength 9. If you double judge, you're going to actually be winning these things on 2s. Even the Doomstalkers, which are very oppressive profiles, are not going to be that much of a danger simply because you have so many anti-tank shooting platforms being your 5 Sagittars. These guys will reliably pick up one Doomstalker a turn. I've had one Sagittar in my games pick up a single Doomstalker, 1-for-1 through shooting. So if you do have 5, I guarantee you'll be able to outtrade in terms of activations. All in all, I think the Votann player has the tools to effectively deal with the Necron units at range and in melee, allowing for favorable trades. That, coupled with the mobility we see through the Sagittars and the bikes, allows for better scoring potential when compared to the slow-moving Necrons, ultimately leading to a victory of 17-3. Now, Game 4 of Votann into Deathguard. I was actually pretty surprised to see Deathguard have such a very close game to Votann, actually the closest matchup out of all the games played at this event. But looking at the list, it actually makes a lot more sense. So, the list consisted of 3 Sorcerers in Terminator armor, Typhus, 3 Predator Destructors, 3 Fetid Bloat-Drones, 3 Plague Burst Crawlers, 3 War Dogs, and some Nurglings. So a lot of 3s. So what we get out of that is good redundancy. It's a very durable list, and it's surprisingly quick. They've actually managed to account for that slowness, that weakness that Deathguard have, and incorporate some units which help compensate with that, and go very vehicle heavy. So innately the list is very durable, it's pretty quick, honestly, for Deathguard, and it does a lot of damage. In a lot of ways, it almost matches the design we see with the Votann list, even down to the characters which are just independently running around. So I actually think out of all the games the Votann player played, this one was probably the closest and most tense. And that's reflected in the scores here, simply because the 2 archetypes used are basically the same. I would imagine it's a very tense game of properly choosing when it's time to trade your Sagittars into one of your opponent's vehicles, and knowing which target should be the recipient to your 10-man Hearthguard brick. It looks like both lists were able to strongly play primary and secondary, but ultimately the Votann player probably edged out ahead, securing him the victory. Game 5 into Eldari, the Eldari player was running a pretty MSU style list with an avatar of Cain inside. So I do think that while Eldari do Eldari things and they're just a really good faction to play, I think that this list has the means of dealing with such MSU styled units simply because of the inclusion of these bikes. You have so many bikes running around the board here that if you're able to get the jump on some of these units, or even just play defensively and wait for them to come to you, I actually think you'll reliably kill any of these. It's also pretty nice that there's an Avatar of Cain, because this is a very good selection for our Judgment token and for our 10-man Hearthguard break with Grim Demeanor. I think that these guys will absolutely melt the Avatar of Cain if they get into combat with him through the shooting and then the melee follow-up. So nothing to worry about on that front. I think the biggest caveat here is trying to survive the waves of these effective datasheets that are coming at you with all of their tricks to effectively fire and fade and deal pretty strong anti-tank shooting. And what we see is that it's another very close game, just being 12-8 here for Votann. But I do think that the win is edged out simply because of the style of list that's being played, allowing us to more effectively trade even our cheap units into their MSUs and being able to pick them up. We also have an abundance of wounds across most of these units, meaning that if we do take a significant amount of damage, there will always, or almost always, be something left over to punch back. Now for the final game of the event, we have another Necron matchup here at Canoptek Court, and slightly different list this time. We've actually included some Technomancers, and we've reduced the number of Canoptek Doomstalkers we have to just 1. However, we've also included a third Catan. The Catans are so annoying, man. So in this list, we're dealing with 3 Catans, 3 times 6 Canoptek rates, and some good stuff sprinkled between. Now, I think this is a very scary list because it's able to hold you down and pin you in place with the rates while your 3 Catan shards are basically just approaching you as a slow impending doom. And I'm kind of interested to know how the player allocated his tokens in this list, if he opted to go with everything on the rates, or maybe he decided to put something on the Catans instead, because there are 3 of them. I usually face 2 when I play against Necrons, and they're really annoying to deal with, but I try to ignore them and not put my Judgment tokens on them at all, actually, because they're so tough to kill, and they usually end up killing things before they reach my center field anyway. So I'm curious if that strategy worked here. or if he decided to commit exclusively to the Catan shards, since this is the bulk of the points in the opponent's list. I will say, however, as a result of the inclusion of 3 Catans, the Necron player is lacking some quick moving damage. He does have some destroyers in the list, but the damage is kind of mid. And with only 1 Doomstalker, I would feel very confident bringing all of my Sagittars out in the open and picking up whatever's present. If I could see the Doomstalker, it's going away. So because of this, surely the Necron player has better center board control, because when he gets his Catans there, it's going to be impossible to shift them. Absolutely. In this case, I think your Hearthguard are probably best used as an anvil and just staying there as long as possible. But the positive is that everything else in your list, the fast-moving bikes, the fast-moving Sagittars, the cargo inside, you simply move that anywhere else. You kite, you go as far as you can, and that's all you care about. You just score. You go for some external primaries. If there's an objective out in the open on the left-hand side, maybe you run there. You stick on the flanks. You'll have an easy time scoring secondaries compared to the Necron player. And as long as you don't necessarily have to stay in the middle, you'll have an easier time scoring primary too. A very scary list to play against, but I actually think the exclusion of the Doomstalkers is actually quite bad into Votann, giving them a significant advantage here. And as we can see with the results, Votann actually get a pretty nice victory of 15-5. I want to give a huge congratulations to Peter for having so much success with this list, and I really do hope he watches this video so he could comment below how the 2 Iron Year champions were used, because I absolutely have no idea, and I basically didn't even include them in any of my discussions for the matchups because I simply don't know how they were played and what purpose they serve. So if he could explain that, that would be awesome, or if any of you have an idea, let me know in the comments below. But a huge congratulations for Peter for taking first place with this list and for engineering something so unique that we've never seen before. And I think it took many of his opponents by surprise too. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. Last week we hit 1,000 subscribers, which is an absolutely amazing milestone for me. So I just want to thank you all again for all your incredible support you've shown me throughout these videos. I have some pretty big plans in the pipeline for the channel that should be coming in the next few months, but that's all I could share for now. If you like this video, please make sure to give it a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Leave me a comment down below. I always try to get back to you, so if you have any thoughts about the list or the format, let me know and we could talk about it. Thanks again, and I'll catch you all in the next one.